Afternoon. So, welcome to the Sloane Lab Online Symposium Series 2023, Reconnecting Heritage Collections as Data, Infrastructure, and Participatory Engagement. My name is Alda Terracciano, and I am Participatory Design Consultant at the Sloane Lab. And I'm joined today by James Baker, Director of Digital Humanities and University at University of Southampton. And of course, our speaker, who I will introduce in a minute. So for those who don't know already, the Sloane Lab is a project funded by the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council program as part of Towards a National Collection, TANC, a major investment using digital technology to create a unified national collection of the UK's galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, with the aim of dissolving barriers between different collections and opening UK heritage to the world. So our project aims to bring together for the first time Sir Hans Sloane's collection in the digital space and to enrich debates on important issues that have shaped the UK's national collections. It does so in a number of ways, including this symposium series, which is convened by Julian Nayan, the principal investigator of Sloane Lab, as well as Andrew Flynn, Andreas Plakidis, Jeremy Hill, and Mark Kareen, who are co-investigators, James Baker, and Alexandra Ortolia-Baird. The series is co-hosted by University College London, Technology University Darmstadt, the British Museum, the Natural History Museum, the University of Southampton, and the University of Portsmouth. Now, this symposium series welcomes a range of speakers interested in the intersections between collections as data, cataloging histories and critical archival studies, heritage infrastructures, critical digital heritage, and information science. It offers us a space to think collectively and explore together with speakers and attendees, both contributing to making this space, that is the symposium, a successful one. Therefore, we value and encourage all points of view expressed to build a constructive dialogue. And in this spirit, questions should be asked through the Q&A function, which Zoom offers us, with respect and generosity in a way that promotes this dialogue and does not shut it down. We will read the questions to the speakers at the end of the session. And I should also remind you that the session will be recorded and released via Sloane Lab's social media outputs. In the highly unusual circumstance that questions are asked in a way that is disruptive, offensive, aggressive, or otherwise unacceptable, we will take appropriate steps, which may include asking the questioner to leave the seminar. But obviously, we are hopeful that this will not be required. So today we are pleased to welcome Jane Collings, Service Manager of the Archives Hub, a JISC service which brings together descriptions of archives from across the UK. We were also supposed to welcome Ananda Rutherford, Research Fellow at University of Arts London, but unfortunately Ananda is not well today, so she had to drop out, and we wish her a prompt recovery. So Jane Collings is an archivist by training and has been working on the Archives Hub for 20 years. She has been the service manager for 15, responsible for the management and development of the service. Her particular areas of interest are archival cataloging and discovery, and how we can make data more interoperable and more widely useful and accessible. She has written a number of papers around these themes and has been a board member of Archives Portal Europe, which is the European archival aggregator. The title of Jane's talk today is The Shortcomings of and Opportunities for Archival Cataloging to create a fuller picture of our histories. And so without any further ado, please, Jane, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to do the usual screen share and start the PowerPoint. There we go. Okay. Right, okay. Thank you very much for asking me to talk today. My talk is going to be very much around this idea of data and archival data and where we want to be going and how we want to be thinking about our catalogues and how we can kind of make more of this amazing data that we've got available to us. So I am a little bit of an archival data geek, so I hope that this will still be entertaining. I actually find it very interesting and entertaining thinking about this kind of data and what we can potentially do with it. I'm not going to talk too much about kind of the Archives Hub and go through the interface, because I'm talking much more about the data side of things. But for those who don't know, the Archives Hub has been around really since 1999, so it's quite an old service by the standards of online services, I guess. And it brings together descriptions of archives from around 400 repositories across the UK. So that's repositories of all shapes and sizes, with, you know, large teams, with like a part-time archivist who, you know, doesn't have any other kind of resources, some that have technical resources, some that don't have any, or sometimes they have some resource for a bit and then it's taken away. So it's this kind of, it's a very interesting thing working with so many diverse archives, you know, charities, higher education, local authorities, business, all sorts of different archives. And nowadays, most of them come to us and say, we'd like to be on the Archives Hub. And they do that because I think we've ended up with quite a good reputation for what we do, and they do find that it helps to promote their collections, and they'll get more researchers using their archives, which after all is the core reason why we are here, to promote archives and get more people using all these wonderful resources. So obviously this isn't so much to talk about the front end, but you can see it's very much, you know, do different searches by different criteria, find the archives that you kind of want, and then maybe go and visit the archive collection. But today I'm going to plunge straight in to actually talk about the data that you know is obviously at the heart of what we do. So I've spent almost my whole career thinking and talking about archival data. And one of the really key things for the Archives Hub is, okay, where are we going to set the bar in terms of the data that we take in? And I've done lots of presentations about this, quite often having pictures of high jumpers and things, because I often think a bit about this, you know, where is the bar? Because if we set it too high, then all these different diverse archives will struggle to be able to provide their data. But if we set it too low, then we feel that that may impact researchers and the experience they have with the data and what they can do with the data. It's interesting, if you look here, you can actually see what we say are mandatory fields. Now, these are mandatory fields at the top level of the archival description. I'm sure a lot of you will be aware that archival description is often hierarchical. So I'm talking about the top overall level here. And immediately you can see that there's an international standard, the International Standard for Archival Description, ISAD as it's usually called, and that has mandatory fields. And that is currently the main international standard for describing archives. And that was created in the 1990s. And it's an interesting thing that people still talk about, well, are we ISAD compliant or aren't we? And I'm a bit like, well, in some ways that isn't really so relevant now, because the standard, I would say, isn't really up to what we need for an online environment. So if you look at this, you can see, interestingly, one of the fields that's missing is the name of repository. That isn't even included as a mandatory field. And I think really the reason for that is that the standard was written at a time when we weren't thinking globally so much. It was a sense of, well, you're already in your repository. That's where you create your descriptions, within your repository. Now we don't think like that. We think we want to create data. We want it to be global. So of course we say you need the name of repository. We also have stuff around, right, we want language, and we want to have structured data like ISO codes where we can. We want to have some information about access, because if somebody's traveling a long way, they want to understand whether they can access that collection. And we have had researchers saying to us, well, yeah, I went to the archive and I had to make an appointment, or it was closed, or whatever. So there you can see the difference in the way of thinking, which I think is kind of interesting. So as I said, we've got these mandatory fields. Now, we have spent a lot of time discussing almost every field that you can get in an archive collection description. I mean, I could talk for hours about any of them. I've just put a couple here to give you the sense of the sorts of things that we kind of grapple with. So whenever, as I said, whenever we say, well, you need to do this, this is where we've set the bar. Whenever we do that, we know that it can be a challenge for some archives. So we need to think carefully about it. Reference is probably the piece of information we've thought about the most of all the pieces of information, because it's so important. And just saying we need a reference to be globally unique has caused quite a lot of challenges for quite a lot of archives, because, again, as I said, that thinking locally, as long as it's unique within our repository, that's fine. Although, to be honest, quite often they haven't been unique within the repository either. So we say you need the country code, you need the repository code, and you need to add that to the reference to create something that's globally unique. I've put dates of creation there. We ask for searchable dates of creation. Again, a lot of cataloging systems don't necessarily make that more prominent or make that more important, but we see that as really important to have. Names is a whole subject in itself, and we've done a lot of guidance around that and around kind of indexing in particular, and that's quite a problematic area. But obviously, if you can structure names better, that gives you more potential. I'm going to come on to that in a little while, actually. I put extent there because I actually wanted to say not everything works that we try and do. So one of the things we tried to do a few years ago is use the extent field, because it's mandatory. We thought, right, we'll use the extent field so we can give a sense of the volume. Say, I've got Beatrice Webb here, like how much stuff does the Archives Hub have on Beatrice Webb? You know, can we add up everything? There's a file and 3 boxes and blah, blah, blah. And we wanted to try and do that and give a visual representation. And we couldn't do it because of the diversity of the data. It was nothing to do with the technology or our expertise in using technology. It was to do with the variations in the data just made it impossible. And that's usually the situation with us. It's not about technology, it's about the data and the challenges of the data. So then, okay, given that I've said that, and given that I've said that's where the problems lie, one of the big things we do is spend a lot of time providing information and advice on how to create good catalogue entries or good data. That really has developed into quite a big area for us, maybe more than we might have thought at the beginning, and it still is, despite maybe changes in perceptions about the importance of this kind of thing. So that is one way that we help to make sure that people are providing better data or understand what we mean kind of by good data. So drilling down into that a bit, what is good data? I've said this quite often before. I think people often say, well, good data is data that meets standards. But as I've already said to you with ISAD-G, and it's the same with some of the other standards that we use, people often say the data meets this standard, but the reality is that, well, sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes the standards don't really meet what is required for an online environment for the sorts of things that researchers need now. So I would say the two most important things with good data are structure and consistency. And if we have structure and consistency, that is really what allows us to do what we want to do with the data. And that's what we're working towards and what I'm talking about today, really. Of course, the reality, you know, and I've been an archivist, I've been on the other end, you know, working with a not very good system with not enough resource and so forth. So we know what the reality is for a lot of our contributors with a lot of the data that they have, with maybe the archival systems aren't really fit for purpose for, you know, where we are now in terms of data in the online environment. And obviously a lot of them, you know, it's volunteer cataloguers. The archivist, the trained archivist maybe don't have the time to catalogue. I do have some feelings about that, about maybe sometimes cataloguing is seen as something you can give to a non-skilled person. And yeah, I believe cataloguing is a skilled process. But anyway, I do understand the situation people are in. A lot of people don't think about catalogues as data in that way. So that's another thing. And they don't think about machine readability, which for us is at the forefront, really. Machine readability, human readability, both equally important. So our contributors, you know, as I said, there's this thing about data and thinking about data. There's the thing about cataloguing practices that may have been around a long time. There's also fundamentally the fact that a lot of our contributors don't really have a good way of analysing their data. And that's really come to the fore over the past few years. I've really realised that if we can do that for them, that provides a really useful service, because it's hard for them to say, right, I want to find out, you know, which of my descriptions have ISO dates for date searching, you know, where I need to add them. And they can't do that necessarily. So the Archives Hub, we give help and support. And one thing I should say, because quite often we go back to a new contributor and say, right, you've got to do all this for your data. You've got to do all these things. And we've never had anyone that's balked at that. Sometimes they say that'll take us quite a long time, but they're always very appreciative of the analysis that we can provide. You know, so that they can understand more about their data. So there's always a willingness. So I'm going to go off on a slightly different tack here. Sorry, this isn't the best slide in the world, but I wanted to move on now to talk a little bit about, right, what do we do? What do we do to create this data, to create this data structure? And it's a long and quite complex process that we needed to put into place. And the process started for us when we built a new system about 7 years ago. It started with the workflow, with when we take the data, what is the workflow going to be? It needs to be repeatable. It needs to be consistent. It needs to allow us to bring the data up to scratch as far as we possibly can. So this is the very first diagram that we created when we were thinking about that. This idea that the data comes in and what do we have to say? Is it compliant? Is it XML compliant? Does it have the name of the repository? And how can we process the data to make it into good data? And the next slide is one of the slides that I've used a great deal in presentations, because this is really at the heart of what we implemented in order to try to make this work. So what you can see here over on the left, you can see some somewhat identical hub contributors. So there are the hub contributors with all their data over there. Over the other side, the user interfaces, what the researchers see and interact with. And then it's kind of what happens in the middle. And what we decided is that we needed something that would be kind of flexible and that we could treat different data from different contributors differently, but group some data together, but be quite kind of flexible and agile in how we went about it. So we started to create these things that we call pipelines, as you can see in the middle. So those pipelines, each of those different colors, if you like, are small pieces of, we do this in something called XSLT, but it's basically a script that looks at the data and processes it in some way. So they're all very small little bits of XSLT that all do different little things and say, you know, does this description have all the parts of the reference code that I need to create a globally unique reference? And, you know, does it have the dates as I need them? Does it have all the mandatory fields? But there's also some processing. So can I improve this? Can I do something to make this more consistent, make it more structured and more usable for researchers? So there's kind of normalization and enhancement built into these pipelines. And we have global pipelines that apply to all of the data. We have group pipelines that we can apply to, say, descriptions that come from CALM or AdLib or Atom or wherever. So we can apply it to all those in that group. And we have individual pipelines for the particularly difficult to handle contributors who will remain nameless. But yeah, sometimes we have to apply stuff just to one particular contributor for whatever reason. So this is what we've spent many years really building up, and we continue to do it. It's like a never-ending process. And it means that we can get new data and say, ah, there's something that we haven't quite seen before. Do we need to add this into our pipelines? So the pipelines kind of come through, and then all of the data goes into something called the SIM, there, CIIM, the SIM, which is our system for creating the indexes and so forth, for allowing the data to be searchable. It comes into there, and then we have the API that provides the data through to any kind of end user interface. So 15 years ago, I used to give presentations about where we wanted to get to in the archives world. And where we wanted to get to was you create the data once, you use it in all sorts of environments. And we weren't there at all at that point. It didn't happen. Now, as you can see, that is what we are able to do. We're able to say this data can now be used on the Archives Hub website, for local sites, for the new Scottish Archives site, for the Archives Portal Europe site. And it can also be used, and we're starting to get some researchers doing this, that a researcher wants the data in a particular way, more as data than as, you know, your traditional archival hierarchical finding aid. And that was where we were looking to get to, and we are kind of there, albeit it still needs to be worked on, as I said. So this is a screenshot of that system called the SIM, where, as you can see, all the descriptions are listed in here. So we create descriptions in an XML standard called EAD, so that you can see the EAD records. It tells you if they're published. And it also tells you if there's errors. So when it's gone through all these pipelines, this workflow, is it good at the end, or are there some issues with it that need resolving? So in this case, there's one from Glasgow where there's a couple of errors. So some of our contributors actually use this themselves to check their data, and then they can say, oh, okay, I need to go away and work on this, or we might do it for them. So it's quite a flexible kind of thing, how it kind of works. So our contributors can contribute by using our cataloging tool, which for historical reasons is called the editor, but it's a cataloging and editing tool. If they use that, then it'll be good compliant data because it's a very good cataloging tool. And obviously it implements all of our best practice around structured data. But they can also export from archival management systems, and they might upload that themselves, or we might do it for them. And over the past year or so, we've actually managed to implement turning spreadsheet data into hierarchical structured archival data, which is no mean feat, and we're still developing that. But that has been hugely important because there's so many archives out there, as I said, that don't have much resource. They may not even have a paid kind of archivist or anyone like that, and they put their data into spreadsheets. Now we can't wave a magic wand, but I think we've done pretty well with what we're able to do in terms of turning those spreadsheets into good data, and putting their stuff out to the world, which is really important. So then, as I said, there's these error messages. So here's just an example from that SIM error message. So that writing in yellow. So for some of our contributors, that would be self-explanatory. They'd be like, okay, the unit ID, I need to go and make sure it's got a country code and a repository code and an identifier to create the unique reference. So some of them will be fine to do that. Some of them just won't have a clue what that means. So we've had to implement something flexible whereby we can do it or they can do it, One thing I should say here that maybe I haven't emphasized, or I did a little bit with that pipeline. So with the enhancements, with the stuff that we do in the pipelines, quite often issues like this we can fix. So there are ways that we can say, oh, they haven't got the data in quite the right place, but we've got a little script that says, take this data and put it here and do this and do that with it. So we have quite a lot of these kind of pipelines that fix the data for them. But we can only do so much of that, obviously. Got to work with the data that we've kind of got. I guess this is self-evident, but the advantages of having this kind of consistency, this kind of structured data, the end user experience, and the data that we can provide out, the innovative approaches that we can take using the data. And I think we're just starting to get glimpses of like the digital humanities researchers coming to us, asking us more about catalogues as data and what they can get. And, they may have a project, they may be doing something. So API access is useful for them. So yes, that's where we are with that. Better end user experience, as I said, just this consistency, of how we kind of present things. In terms of how people can filter, actually subjects is a whole nother ball game, which we do a certain amount with, but yeah, that would take a whole nother presentation. But we try and do what we can to improve all of the data. But subjects, there's a lot of diversity around how people index things, whether they index them at all and whether they use thesauri and so forth. And as I said, we provide the data to the Archives Portal Europe. So scholars who want to search across European archives, all the Archives Hub data is in there. Scotland are creating their own portal. We provide the data to that, and that means that we're getting a lot of often really quite small community-based Scottish archives joining us, which has been interesting, quite challenging, quite an exciting time. Now, I also just wanted to spend a bit of time now at the end, just saying that one of the things we were really keen on longer term with this whole process is to be able to be more innovative with the data on behalf of our contributors, the sorts of things that they don't necessarily have the expertise or the resources to do. So one of the things that we've been looking at is a kind of structuring names and being able to bring names together. And I've done a lot of detailed blog posts on this and what we've done. And you can see here in this example, Beatrice Webb letters, the name of creator, Webb, Martha Beatrice, dates, epithet. Now, in the past, if somebody did a different string, so they put Beatrice Webb or they put MB Webb or whatever, it's like, how can we say that those are the same people? That is a hugely difficult thing to actually deal with, and that's something we've been trying to look into and kind of work on with this data. So this is a screenshot that shows you just how difficult it is. So this is my only slide that has some EAD on it. But the point is here, when we started doing that and saying, well, can we bring the names together? Can we say, well, that person from that archive in Aberdeen, it's the same as that person from that archive in Exeter. My goodness. So actually we can bring them together and create that connection. Whereas previously nobody's really realized and made that join. So hugely powerful potentially. But then it's like, right, here's the data. So you can see here, the top one is a name, and then there's brackets, and then there's a colon, and there's spaces, and you know, the way it's kind of formatted, it's quite difficult. The second example here is a name that is name of author various. This is a really good example of where I come back to that idea that we need our catalogers to think more of semantics and of this as data. That should have a name in it, a name. It shouldn't have anything else. If you want to put various authors, it shouldn't go into the name field. The third one is a beautiful structured name. And if they were all like that, there's a lot we could do with the names. So that comes from our own cataloging tool. The one after that, Gerald and Joy Finzi, is just my nemesis, because those are really hard to work with when people put something like that. But you can see how it happens. It happens because for a human, if they read, oh, the creators of this archive are Gerald and Joy Finzi, that's fine. The trouble is for a machine to process it and say, what's this name? How can I match it to other names? It's really difficult. And then you can see a few others there. You can see, yeah, we've got a bit of a mountain to climb with this. So what we actually did with this is tried to create rules to help us with structuring these names, which was incredibly difficult. So I've just put one example here. So if you can see that Shaw, comma, George Bernard, comma, well, if all the names were even structured like that, we could say, well, it's the surname and then the forename and then the date, but they aren't. They're all over the place. They've got all different sorts of formatting. So I had to try and look at loads and loads and loads of names and come up with rules that would deal with the vast majority of names to structure them. Some of them will fall through the cracks, you know. Yeah, so it's a really interesting project. So, you know, that means that we can implement what we've tried to do. Yes, I think I've got an example here. So what we're going to implement is a more structured name search on the end user interface. But of course, the idea, as I've said, you know, with data, is we can do other things. We can link out to Wikidata. We can do all sorts of different things. But on our front end, it was about, can we structure the data such that we can bring names together more successfully and say, here's all the archives that are about Martha Beatrice Webb. And you can do that by separating out the pieces of information. So that's what we're trying to do. And finally, and I've gone over a bit because we don't have another speaker, so I hope that's okay. I was going to show you another innovative project we've been working on. And I'm going to actually try with this to, yes, that's okay, that's worked. So something else which is also about images and other things, but it brings in this idea of the data and how we can work with the data. Our Archives Hub Labs, we've been looking at working with the IIIF standard for images and machine learning. So the big kind of AI, we wanted to start exploring that kind of area on behalf of our contributors. this is our development site. So just to say, it's not an end interface for the public yet. So it has, you know, it's not polished, is what I kind of mean. So we've got a number of contributors we're working with on this, and we're just playing around, exploring. And one of the things we're trying to do is look at how images can be more successfully integrated with archival data, with the cataloguing descriptions, or with other aspects of the descriptions as data, because so often images, and I'm sure you've seen this, you know, a lot of sites, that wonderful sites for searching for images, but they do not bring in the archival context. The two are separate. The archival catalogue is done by different people. It's a whole different thing to the image search. And in fact, we know for a lot of our contributors, what happens is they do descriptions again for the images. They don't use the cataloguing data. They write new descriptions. So you've gone back to that, doing it twice kind of thing. So that's what we're trying to do. So let's just see if I can get this to work. As I said, this is experimental, so I'm going to have to see if it actually works. So yeah, we're just showing our participants in it how we might bring the images in alongside the descriptions that we're actually pulling in. And this, there's a lot here around, well, is this described at item level? I mean, this desk is described at item level, but as you'll probably know, not all archives are described at item level. So do we bring in the collection level or the series level? And how would that play to researchers? Does that make it clear? Does that kind of help with the context or hinder it? So we've been trying to do a lot of that, but then with these beautiful kind of zoomable IIIF images. And finally, I just wanted to quickly show you the other part of this project. I'm hoping this works again. So this is the machine learning side. Let's see. Yep. Okay. Jolly good. So here we're using these IIIF images, and we're actually bringing machine learning in, and we don't know other people that are really doing this. So it's kind of interesting, very experimental. But here what you can see is the machine learning has gone through and identified items within this photograph and has listed them down here. So a couple of them have these bounding boxes, most of them don't. And we've done quite a lot around just setting this up, setting up the infrastructure to be able to run this at the moment. And from here, we want to start looking at, you know, how useful is it? How might we present this to end users? And this idea of the confidence level, and it being very different from traditional cataloguing, in that archivists, we've always kind of said you can trust archive catalogues, you know, and now we're kind of saying machine learning could add terms, but can you trust them? You know, and there is a level of trust, and, you know, should we go with anything that's over 90%, or should we go with things that are only kind of 50%? And will it help researchers to find stuff because they actually want to look at things on bricks or paths or tarmac or whatever, you know, the machine learning has come up with. So yeah, so that's what we've been doing. And I think I can stop there because I've just got my final slide saying thank you. So there we go.
Thank you very much, Jane. And James is going to facilitate now the Q&A. Thank you really for an absolutely fascinating presentation. I'm also very much hooked on data, so.
Some of us are, we just can't help it. What can you do?
Yeah. You gave me ideas as well, and I think I will need to get in touch with you about one of our archives, but that's another story.
Okay. Certainly, yeah. But if anyone wants to ask anything, also tangentially to this, to anything to do with archival cataloguing or the hub, you know, please feel free.
Yeah, wonderful. So James, yeah.
Thank you, and thank you, Jane, for leading us through the wonderful work that Archives Hub does. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A. I'll just encourage anyone who has yet to ask a question, and they might have one, to put that in, and I'll go in time order from the ones that have come in. So firstly, from one of our co-conveners, Alexandra, who says thank you, fascinating, etc. And asks if you could elaborate more on how you've approached the name disambiguation issue at technical level. To what extent has this been successful for existing data, or is the plan more forward-looking through changing the data entry parameters for the future?
Okay, so I'm going to just give me a minute because I want to show you.
You're going to risk a live demo.
No, not exactly, but I'm going to share my screen again just to show you. Okay, so I've gone into the blog posts that we did for this. Okay, so what was really interesting about this names work is we started off very excited because what we wanted to do was take the descriptions, take the names within the descriptions and connect to the world, connect to whatever data is out there. You know, as I said, Wikidata or bibliographic cataloging systems or other databases, to bring this wonderful archive data out kind of into the world and make it part of the global kind of data, if you like. So we started with that idea. And then we started to look at how the names were structured. In fact, I've come onto one of the blog posts, and this shows you the sort of work that I did. So I was doing the analysis of the names and providing this information to the kind of technical person who was going to kind of be doing more the coding side of it. And what we quickly realized is we couldn't do anything unless we tried to actually structure the names better because of what I showed you, because most names in catalogs are just structured not very well, or actually really quite badly, if I'm being quite honest, for various reasons. I don't want to be critical, and I understand why that's happened. So in fact, here is an example of, I put this table in a blog post to show the sorts of things that are problematic, where I've just taken one name at random, and it's like sometimes the name is put in with no structure at all, sometimes within it. I mean, we don't know if these are the same people, obviously. That's what I'm trying to say, you know, but they kind of could be. You know, how can we bring them together? How can we say to a researcher, this might be the person you're interested in? And they're like, oh my goodness, I didn't know that existed. You know, it's the idea. So some of them aren't structured, some of them are kind of structured with surname, forename, and life date. Some have floret dates, which is very common in archives, and some have kind of epithets. So it was doing a lot of this, and then literally, as I said, coming up with, are there any rules that we can come up with so that we can take this name, James Carmichael Watson. So this is a name in a description, and we can say, that's the surname and that's the forename, because that at least helps us with matching names, because it's all about matching, you know. And so that's what we did. We literally wrote as many rules as we possibly could. Now we're trying to implement them. Let me just move that. I think I've got that. Yeah, this is actually our, this isn't yet live, but we're trying to implement them on our new interface. So this is stage one, really, and we're going to see how this goes with end users. So in the past, if you clicked on a name of creator or a name as an index term, what would happen is you'd be searching for that string. And you can immediately see the shortcoming with that. If you're searching for that string, you're probably not going to get loads of hits, because not everyone is going to put the name in exactly like that. And that's been the problem. And then you could say to me, well, that's fine, we'll take the epithet off, you know. And I could say, yes, but it's not always date then epithet. So I can't just say take the epithet off, it's the bit after the date, because of the variation. So that's why we had to do all this work. And then what we've done, as I showed you, is where we've been able to structure the names, we're going to actually present that to end users. So again, this is quite innovative. This isn't something that usually happens, but we're saying there's the name, there's the epithet, there's the date in this case. And we're saying, right, it must include these bits and it should include these bits. So where you've got Beatrice Webb and the dates aren't in, then it's still going to match up. That makes sense. So you're getting more matches. And that's such a huge thing in terms of researchers being able to navigate across and find stuff that's kind of relevant. But I can assure you, I'm a bit worried because I'll probably pick one that this, right, so in this case, it hasn't worked because we're still having problems with the structure. So it's a bit risky putting this out there. I think it's an interesting world now because it's like, do we put it out there because it works for quite a lot of the names and it will help? But then here, it's a bit like, oh, that's a bit rubbish, isn't it? Because matching on that string, you're just going to get the thing that you looked for. Yeah. So, yeah, that's kind of where we've been with it. And yeah, we're just going to have to see how people react to that and see where we can kind of go from there with it.
Thank you so much for the comprehensive answer. It's really great.
Yeah,
and
that was quite comprehensive. I just find it so interesting, but you know.
I put the link to the blog post in the in the chat, and Alexandra says that's really helpful. So that's great.
I'll be shorter with the next one.
I'll crack over the next. They've got two more definitely, and I've got one for you as well. Hopefully we can fit in. So next one's from Marco Humble, who again fascinating, asks in particular if you could elaborate on the discrepancies between good and data reality. Do you have experiences with potential drawbacks in standardizing data, for instance, with respect to local naming conventions of places? If so, which ways might mitigate such issues?
Okay, so yeah, so that could be a long answer, but I'm going to stay pretty short. What we've ended up doing far more than I ever would have thought is dipping into archival cataloging systems. Because in the end, so if people use our cataloging system, that's fine. But obviously, they're often using Calm, AdLib, Atom, Emu, whatever, different cataloging systems. That's the majority of archives in the UK. So what's been really important is for us, as far as we possibly can, to go into those cataloging systems, and we've run sessions where we're showing them the system and saying, right, well, this is the best way to do it. If you can do it like this, so we know the reality, you've got this system, you've got to work with this system, but rather than doing it this way, if you do it this way, the data will be more structured. Just two examples off the top of my head. We've had contributors that have put language in and they've put English, French, German. And so it's like, no, don't do that. You know, repeat the field, open 3 instances of the field and have language English, language French, language German. You know, that's just a straightforward one. But, you know, a lot of people didn't do that because they didn't understand the need for that. Just another quick example, names in these kind of cataloging systems are notoriously, I would say, people, they don't encourage the sort of structure that we want. So we go in and often show people how they can put the name in a more structured way and separate out the kind of data. Or just, you know, a really simple example, like some people weren't going into the admin interface for their cataloging system and ticking the box that says all references must be unique. That's a very simple one. But some people, it's like, oh, you know, problem solved. So yeah, so quite a lot of that because that's going to where people are and doing something that they can realistically, you know, do to improve their data.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the next question in the chat, so in the Q&A, which is from Kiri Ross-Jones, who, again, great talk. Thank you. They ask, would you still recommend ISAG for archival cataloging, or do you think there's something else better or that there should be? They're interested to hear about recommendations that make catalog data more accessible and easily linked.
Yeah, you see, I can't say I wouldn't recommend ISAG because basically there isn't anything else. Now there's a new standard on the block, so to speak, that some of you may have heard of, affectionately known as RIC, and it's records in context. Now, records in context is going for this much more structured approach that I've talked about. It's talking about separating out entities and connecting them and all that. So a lot of the stuff I was talking about today. But I mean, I would say that Rick is kind of saying, well, we don't need to change the international standards that we have. We just need to add Rick into the mix. I'm a little bit dubious about that, because I think ISAG does need revising. And I think, to me, ISAG is not really compatible with this new entity relationship-based way of doing things. But no, there isn't any other standard out there that I could say this standard is better. And if you are ISAG compliant, that is a good thing. It's just that there's a lot more to it than that. So I'd say have a look at the Archives Hub information on good cataloguing.
Amazing, thank you. There's no other questions at the moment in the Q&A, so if the other chairs are happy, I'm going to ask a question. And I wonder if I could ask a question about federation of data. We've had quite a lot of experience now, I guess, as sectors of federating data through obviously Archives Hub, but also examples like Europeana. And I'd be really keen to hear your kind of reflections on the problems, the downsides, and maybe the dangers of potentially a federation. And I'm thinking here with the kind of more critical perspective of the seminar series, and also kind of with my sort of historian hat on, because some of the kind of early years, the dreams of federation in sort of the 70s and 80s were very much pushed back against by notions of my collection is special, or I need all the nuance, I need all the detail. And I think now, and that certainly was, that was a kind of complaint that was predicated on a real faith in the idea that cataloguing was neutral and objective, which I think we can now largely accept isn't the case. So, and you said at one point that one of the aims of cataloguers is to ensure we can trust archival catalogues. And I agree that should be an ambition, but I also often wonder whether, with the greatest respect to my colleagues in cataloguing, and I agree we need to invest more in cataloguing labour, certainly. I often wonder whether we should agree to trust archival catalogues a little less. And what the implication of that is for federators, because federators ultimately do things like, to some extent, decontextualize archival data. Obviously the connection is drawn back, but it can take it from a user experience. They become a collection of archives that are kind of decontextualized a little from the source. So I wonder if you could speak to federation. But of course, I accept federation is wonderful for access and everything else. I wonder if you could speak to some of the potential problems of federation.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Of course, I mean, context in itself, it's an interesting question, isn't it? And I think we are moving more towards an understanding that there is what we think of as archival context. And as I said, we're trying to bring that through to digital materials and images and things, and the importance of that. So we still see that as important. But broader context, and this RIC standard is trying to say there are broader context. You know, it really is emphasizing that understanding what this archive is and the myriad of meanings that it might have, the way to do that is to understand and see broader, different contexts. So one thing I would say is that maybe bringing stuff together is a way to actually potentially encourage that kind of broader contextual positioning, which is one thing we're trying to do, which goes back to this problem with the data and the structure, you know. So I actually would see that maybe as an advantage, because we're trying to preserve archival context, and we have, you know, I think it's bringing the data together, which can create different contexts, but it's also having the technical skills and understanding and resources for what you can do, like machine learning. Actually, there's headline news, and there's also machine learning in cultural heritage in archives, and actually it's really hard, because we've been trying to do it with machine learning experts, you know. But the downsides, yeah, I think, so trust is an interesting thing, because obviously we're slightly divorcing the data from the archivists, from the office, from the experts who have the archives. So that's always been something that people have slightly worried about. In reality, I don't think that we've found that people have an issue with that. because we do a lot to push people back to our contributors. So I think that's key. And that's an interesting thing, thinking about what you're saying. I think there used to be more of a sense that come to our aggregation and this is kind of where it's at, you know, whereas our thing is, right, the aggregation is the discovery tool, but of course, go back to the archive, to the experts, to the people that know about this kind of material. So it's mitigating that kind of issue. Yeah, other downsides, I mean,
you don't have to list loads if you don't feel like.
No, it's an interesting question, because I think interestingly, I thought at one point some years back, is aggregation and is the Archives Hub going to become more redundant? And interestingly, the National Archives that were aggregating data for a while, they stopped because they thought, right, we don't need to do this anymore because technology and everyone can put things online. And I think personally, the interesting thing is it's almost become more important because this is the way that we can club together and look at things like AAAF and machine learning and the latest technology and the latest tools. And most archives haven't got a hope in hell of doing that on their own. You know, I think I'm going to advantages, aren't I? Sorry.
No, that's fine. And that's a really wonderful answer. And particularly when you mentioned about linking back to the archival source, I think that has real implications for collections of data and the extent to which we use the aggregator as the data, or whether you use the aggregator plus the connection back to the source as our collections as data. Yeah. We do have another question in the Q&A though, so I'll probably switch to that. From Amalia, who will be speaking at our next seminar. Who, again, wonderful, thank you for the presentation, asks, regarding name matching and disambiguation, to go back to that point, do you think engaging the public or participatory scholars who could link the dots would be useful? Though I can imagine might end up being more work.
We've obviously talked about that. We didn't get that far because getting this far was really hard work. But we've talked about whether you could do a thing where, you know, if so many people say this is the same person, would you trust that link? Yes, so that's the kind of thing down the line we might be interested in. Another thing we might be interested in, coming back to machine learning, is could that potentially be used in this area, or will it prove to be too problematic because of the lack of structure? So we'd love to, we would like to run machine learning on more of the data and see what we get out of that, including kind of the names. The other thing is just if archivists would add unique global identifiers to names, and then everything would be fantastic.
James, I have a question as well.
Of course.
I wonder, because that kind of workflow that you showed us at the very beginning kind of brought back the very early stage, if there was any issue around structure, consistency, you would kind of go back to the creators or, you know, the owners of the archive, and somehow I can see people getting stuck in the cycle because perhaps they don't have the resources, because you know, it's resources that you know, were long, you know, where the creators were long gone, etc., etc. And I wonder if you see a space for AI in supporting archives in this process of standardizing and creating structures for the data that then makes it easier, so that it's not the burden, is not necessarily on you as a hub, but is actually empowering the creators of the archive owners to actually use the tools, and then, you know, being able to give you data in a way that is more streamlined and is acceptable for your own standards.
So I can't answer that too much at the moment because we're in the exploratory stages, but what I can say about that is, in the blog post, I've detailed this quite a lot. One of the things that people will know about machine learning is what you get out depends upon the algorithm. You know, it depends upon kind of, it's the data in, data out thing. So it's still the old paradigm in a way. And one of the things we're finding is archives have their own challenges, their own kind of idiosyncrasies, their own historical perspective and so forth. And so when we've done out of the box stuff, it's like maybe it's not as good as we would want. We're not getting what is going to be appropriate for us as an archival community. And so I think potentially, possibly, yes, but we're going to need to do this training the model, a lot more training the model. And going back to what James said about the advantages or not of federation, in order for us as a community to train models to potentially be able to use machine learning more successfully, we need to bring the data together, because you need to give it large amounts of training data, you know, and say, this is right and this is wrong, you know, and this is yeah, this is good. These are all examples, you know. It's like the dog cat example, you know, a little more sophisticated in our case. So I think it's down the line, and I think that's what we've got to start with. And we can only do that if we're interested in coming together as a community and bringing our historical images together to say, can we identify items in a kitchen from the 1940s? Well, if you try and do that with the algorithms now, they get it wrong. They can get items in kitchens from the 2020, you know, but we've done interesting ones where it says, oh, that's a mobile phone that somebody's holding, and it's like, it's 100 years ago, you know, that kind of thing. So we need to bring the data together and train the algorithms to create something that we can then potentially use.
And I think, thank you for that. And I think your question also partially answers another question we had in the Q&A from Lucy Havens, who's asking a bit about whether you are purely using machine learning for standardizing the structure of metadata or for other purposes, sort of, and, you know, text and image. And you already started to talk about image there. Any other kind of, I guess the point is, there any other sort of examples of the use of machine learning within Archives Hub that you could tell us about that are not just about, I guess, standardizing structures of data?
When we started the project, we came up with a whole list, and then we didn't get very far because actually there were so many challenges to begin with. We started with just images. We were very interested in doing images with text, like posters and things like that, because that's quite an archival kind of area, if you know what I mean, archival material. And so we want to go down that with things like posters and flyers and leaflets and different fonts and texts, and see if we can do some training around that. We also we're interested particularly in the administrative biographical history. We thought we might focus on, because there was a lot of rich information in these histories about creators that isn't really used as data at all at the moment, isn't really tapped in that way. And so probably what we're going to try and do is take all of those, with the permission of our contributors, and run them through and see what happens in terms of it pulling out entities and what it can tell us. And just to finish, the thing that kind of slightly blows my mind with machine learning, and I'm not an expert on it, but it is that thing of, it's so different from writing code where you say, I'm going to put this in and I'm going to write code because I want this. With machine learning, it's like, I'm going to put this in and I don't quite know what's going to happen. You know, it's like you've got to be experimental, and you've got to see what outputs you get, and then from there see if you can train it to improve what you get. So it's so different way of thinking.
Thank you so much. And we've got another question popped into the Q&A. Everyone keeps popping them in just as you're about to finish. And this one's a different topic. So Rositra Tanasova asks, again, thank you for detail. They're really pleased to hear about the use of AAAF standard in your lab space. And the question really is if they plan to provide a AAAF service for the small archives via Archives Hub, because AAAF can also help with creating thematic collections for contributors. And Rositra notes, because I think there was a AAAF conference last week, that French archives are also implementing Mirador 3, and there's recordings available, etc. to follow up on. So the question really is, are there plans for more AAAF to support smaller archives?
Yeah, so in fact, we started the whole project with the idea of providing a store for people. The problem we have is, if we provide a store, how much will it cost for us to build it and run it? Will there be a charge as a result to cover the cost? Because obviously JISC provides the Archives Hub for free. And what we tried to do is judge interest in the store, but we didn't get enough response to know whether if we invest the time and effort, we will get the people, and you know how much people might be prepared to pay. It would be low cost, but still, you know. So we got slightly stuck with that. So we decided that maybe the best thing is to do a little bit more around the benefits of what can happen with IIIF, provide this beta interface to people to show this is the kind of thing we can do. And because we're then showing the benefits, it might be easier for us to engage with the community and say, do you need us to host your images on a IIIF server? This is the sort of thing that we can do as a result of that, you know, because we just didn't get enough response to be able to gauge if it's something we should invest in for the community or not.
Thank you. I think on this occasion, a question hasn't dropped into the Q&A moments before you're about to finish your answer. So unless anyone has any final burning questions, I would suggest that we draw this to close. So
thank you for all the questions. That's lovely. Thank you. I hope that means that people found it reasonably.
So thank you so much, Jane, for your wonderful presentation, for answering all the many questions that both the panel but also the attendees had. Before you go, and we should give you a brief sort of round of applause. Thank you very much. Before we close, I just want to let everybody know that next time we have another Sloane Lab seminar on the 22nd of June, and this will be the final one of the series, which has come around remarkably quickly. We'll have Rosemary Grennan from the Mayday Rooms archive talking about leftovers from a digital archive, and Amalia Levy from Bonn University Centre for Dependency and Slavery Studies talking about archival dependencies and the cascading violence of colonial records, which I thoroughly look forward to both those. And hopefully we'll see many or most, if not all of you, at our next Sloane Lab seminar. And what remains is to thank Jane once again and to let everyone go. So thank you so much, Jane.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jane.
Have a good weekend, everybody. Bye. Bye.
Bye.